All right, good morning, everyone. All right, so today what we're going to do is finish up the second lecture, and then we are going to pull up some scholarly articles, and I'm going to kind of talk you through them, show you the sections that I recommend that you read, the sections that I recommend that you avoid, as well as things to look for when you're doing your literature review for our policy brief. And where to find those things. We also have our first quiz today. So before we leave, I'll make sure that everybody's on the same page about that, about who's playing Jeopardy, how we take the quiz, so on and so forth. Do we have any questions before we get started? No questions?
Yes, I wasn't here for like the first 2 minutes, so whatever you said, I didn't get.
I literally just started talking. I'm always muted while I let everybody in so that you don't have to hear those incessant beeps. Basically, I just told you guys that we're going over the lecture and asked if you had questions. Any questions? No questions? Okay. All right. Okay. Can we all see the lecture? We good? Okay. All right. So this week was kind of a crash course in evidence-based corrections. We talked about the 4 ways to do this with a literature review, a meta-analysis, simulation studies, also the scientific method scoring system. A lot of times when researchers will do a meta-analysis, they will utilize the scientific method scoring system, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they don't do that. The most common scientific method scoring system is the Maryland scale, where they rate studies in terms of their methodological quality or how good their research design is, their research methods. They'll rate it on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is a terrible study and 5 is a great study. 5 is always the gold standard. That always involves some sort of randomization, which can remove systematic bias that might drive our results. Then we talked a little bit about literature reviews because that's what you guys will be doing for this class. We talked about how they're a little bit subjective depending on the person doing it. It's really unsystematic because basically you're not taking note of where you're getting all your studies, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So a lot of times when we have 2 different people doing lit reviews on the same topic, they might come up with divergent findings. Then we talked about some methodological shortcomings, things to note. So whether or not your study has a control group, that's always important to note. That should be the first thing you're looking for. And if they do have a control group, you always want to note how they're choosing who goes in the treatment in the control group. If it's a random assignment, that's great. If not, it will be what we refer to as a quasi-experimental study instead of a randomized experimental study. If you see the phrase quasi-experimental, that means that they couldn't use randomization. So they are using statistics and statistical controls to try to balance that treatment and that control group because they couldn't use randomization. So you'll see the phrase quasi-experimental today. That's always something that you want to note in your research design because that means that they are aware that they couldn't do randomization, but they're doing their best to make up for that. And then we also talked about sample size. So if they're doing statistics, you want to see at least 150, otherwise the statistics become a little bit unstable. One thing that I will note, occasionally you guys might be pulling some qualitative studies. Qualitative just means it's interviews or observations. Quantitative means they're dealing with large numbers and data sets. So if it's a qualitative study, meaning they interviewed people or they were observing things, a lot of times, most of them are interviews. A lot of times they will have trouble hitting 150 because most interviews take over an hour. So that's a lot of hours a researcher might have to put in. So if you're looking at a qualitative study and they don't have 150 people, that's not as big of a red flag as if they were trying to run statistics. However, if they're talking to 3 people, that's a problem, right? We want to see maybe like 50, perhaps 25, 50, something like that, depending on what they're trying to find. But again, this is something that we can discuss moving forward. If you think the sample size is really small, but you're not sure, shoot me an email and I'm happy to look through it and go over it with you. So that's where we left off. So do these shortcomings make a difference? Why do we care about this? Yes, they actually make a huge difference. There was a study done about 20 years ago, Weisberg and colleagues, and they looked at 68 correctional program evaluations. So they pulled 68 studies that were examining how well treatment program works for juvenile offenders. And what they found was that the type and the quality of the research design was actually more predictive of the outcome than the actual intervention. So let me clarify. The worse the study was, the lower that quality, so closer to like 1 and 2 on the Maryland scale, the worse the study was, the more likely it was to show that the program was effective. The more rigorous the evaluation, the better the research methods, the more likely they were to find an average treatment effect of 0. So this is what we refer to as the null effect. The null effect means that the treatment didn't improve or make this person worse, right? So the treatment had 0 effect. It didn't reduce recidivism or increase recidivism. Recidivism stayed the same. So if you see the phrase the null effect, that just means the treatment effect was 0. It had no effect whatsoever. So this is pretty common in research. So if we think back to that silly example I gave you of drinking a cup of coffee to see if that makes you faster. So starting with our first design, which was really bad, right? We just pulled a bunch of people from the track team, gave them coffee and had them race, right? That's a bad research design. And it would look like, if we weren't controlling for if they were on the track team or not, it would look like your treatment effect, which would be the effect of coffee, was effective, right? So the more strong our research design is, the less likely we are going to find that a treatment program is actually effective, because we are controlling for all of those things that could potentially confound those results. So this is pretty common. So if you are seeing the results of a study that shows that some program reduces recidivism by like 50, 60%, that should raise a red flag, and you should look through those research, the research methodology, because chances are there are some problems with that. The stronger the study, the more likely it is to show that the treatment has a null effect. And just think about it like this. So most people that are involved in a correctional treatment program, they're already incarcerated, right? So this is somebody that has lived a life that has led them to be incarcerated in a state or a federal penitentiary. It is unlikely that going through an education program for maybe 6 months is going to turn their entire life around, right? We're not expecting to see a 100% turnaround. It's probably going to help, 5, 6, 7% of the people in the sample, but we're not going to see a huge finding, right? So if you're seeing huge findings, take a look at those research methods. That might be where the problem is. So the next question is, why does this matter? And it's very simple. Who pays for correction-based rehabilitation programs? Who's paying for that?
Would it be the state?
Well, who's giving the state the money?
The taxpayers.
Yeah. So we don't want to be wasting money on programs that aren't effective, right? So if we have a warden that says, all right, I want to implement a prison-based rehabilitation program, but they pull a bunch of studies and aren't aware of research methodology, and they find a bunch of bad research that shows that a particular program works, they're going to use a portion of the correctional budget, which comes out of our taxes, to implement this program that is not going to work. So you need to be at least somewhat aware of research methods so that you can understand if you should trust these findings, because correctional budgets are huge. They come out of our pockets. We want to make sure that the research they're basing these programs on is good research. All right. let's shift gears a little bit. Does everybody understand some of those? Even if you're having a little bit of trouble with the research methodology stuff right now, we're going to work on this all semester. So even if you're a little bit fuzzy, we're going to keep working on it. And if you need to schedule one-on-one meetings with me, I'm happy to do that with you. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to sort of walk you through how to read scholarly articles and the things that you need to be noting when you're reading these scholarly articles. So anytime you're doing a literature review, there are 3 things you want to pay attention to, especially in this class, but in general, if you're doing a lit review for any topic, there are 3 things that you should know. 1, research methods. How are they doing this research? Okay. 2, what are the results? And 3, are there any limitations or problems with the research, any methodological shortcomings that might make you question those results? Okay. So those are the 3 things you always want to pay attention to when you're doing a lit review. Other classes may not focus so much on the limitations, but I think as an educated person, that's something that you should always pay attention to. You'd be surprised how much bullshit research there is out there. And it's really easy to tell if you simply just scan through the methods to see if what you're reading is legitimate research. So let's talk about where we find the things in these articles. So I'm sure you guys have noticed before, scholarly articles are usually like 30 to 40 pages long. That is because they are written for a variety of audiences. There are certain sections that are written for the average consumer, certain sections that are written for an undergraduate that might have a little bit of an understanding of research methods. And there are sections written for me, people with PhDs in criminology research that are looking for big statistical problems, right? And I'm going to show you the different parts of the articles to read that you will understand. So the first thing you always want to read is the abstract, which is that little blurb at the top. And a lot of times students will skip right over that. I'm here to tell you, a lot of times you can just read the abstract and you don't need to read much more of the article. So it's up to the author to write the abstract. And a lot of times they will tell you the research methods and the results in like 4 sentences. Usually the last couple of sentences of an abstract are the results. Occasionally you'll have a researcher that's a little cagey and they'll say something like important findings will be discussed. I've been known to do that because we want people to buy the article. You can see the abstract for free, but if we're trying to get you to buy the article, we'll write something cagey like important findings will be discussed, and then you have to download the whole article to see the actual results. But always start with the abstract because a lot of authors will just tell you the results right there, as well as either all of the research design or like 75% of it. So we're always going to start with the abstract. So then when we start going through looking for the specific things I'm talking about, the research design, the results, and the limitation, starting with the research design. Again, start with the abstract. You might find some of the research design or all of it, or maybe none of it. If you can't find all of it in the abstract, the next section you want to look for is something called the present study, the current study, data and methods, research design, methodology, anything that indicates that they're about to tell you how they did their research. After you've tracked all of that down, and I'm going to show you the things that you need to get about that, the next thing you want to find are the results. Like I said, a lot of times they're written out in plain English in the abstract, but if not, if they only give you part of the results or they're cagey and they say, we'll tell you the results once you buy this article, which you don't have to buy because you have access to it through the Citadel. The next section you want to go to is the discussion. It's not always the case, but a lot of times if you're dealing with a scholarly article that does complex statistics, the results section is going to be full of those statistical terms. So a lot of times students will go straight to the results, start reading about Cox regression coefficients and get really frustrated because a coefficient doesn't mean shit, right? You need to actually do mathematical calculations to turn that coefficient into a percentage, which they're going to do for you in the discussion. So a lot of times what I recommend is students can, if you start scanning through the results, if they don't make sense, skip it completely and go to the discussion where they're going to tell you in plain English what those results are. The discussion section of an article is where the authors are going to explain why the results say what they do, or if they got a weird finding, they're going to explain that. But usually that first paragraph of the discussion is a summary of the results in plain English. They're going to take those regression coefficients and say, participating in a prison-based education program reduces rearrest by 20%. That is something that makes sense to most people. If the discussion, sometimes there's no discussion, sometimes they'll jam their results and discussion into one section. If you're seeing that, skip to the conclusion. A lot of times the first 2 sentences of the conclusion are the results of the article. So don't get frustrated. Like I said, just kind of scan the results. If they start talking about shit you don't understand, go right to the discussion and the conclusion. They're going to say it in plain English. So the last thing I want you guys to note are any problems with the study. So any limitations. So a lot of authors, especially good social scientists, will have a section called limitations, and it's always at the end, where they will tell you exactly what the limitations of their study were and how you interpret the results for that. This is a section I always include because I would rather be able to say, these were the problems with my study than have somebody come in and say, this was a problem and she didn't even mention it, which indicates I didn't realize it was a problem. So I would rather tell the reader, this is something that I couldn't do. This is why I couldn't do it. And this is how you interpret my results with this, right? So for instance, if I only had access to data for males, I would say future researchers should study females, but for my results, you're going to say this program works this way for males, right? So look for that limitation section. Sometimes researchers don't call it a limitation section. They'll call it suggestions for future research, which means I couldn't do it, which is a limitation of my study. Other researchers should do it. So if there's no limitation section, start looking for a section called suggestions for future research. That usually means I'm going to admit what I couldn't do in my study. Occasionally, there will not be a limitations or suggestion for future research study. Sometimes some authors will just have a paragraph in their discussion that describes their limitations. So if you can't find either of those sections, I recommend like Control F to search the PDF, and we'll search for that word limitation and you'll find it buried somewhere. If you don't see an author mentioning limitations, that is a red flag. We want transparency in research, which is why there's usually 16 pages of the research design, which you guys don't have to read the whole thing. I'll show you what to look for. But if they're not mentioning their limitations, that's usually a red flag. All right, let's start going through some articles. Okay, so we're going to start with this article. Anytime you see Grant Dew, this man does great research. So this right here, that's an indication. If you choose education programs, you'll probably find a bunch of studies by him. He always does great stuff. So what we're looking for here, the effects of prison-based education programming on recidivism and employment. So let's start with the abstract. And I can see a little bit of information that would go in the research design, but I also see all the results right here. So who wants to pop their mic on and tell me important information that we want to include, either the results or stuff we would want to include in our research design that indicates this is how they're doing the study?
So it gives you the time frame from between 2007 and 2008.
Perfect. We want to make sure we include offenders released from Minnesota between 2007 and 2008, right? So right there, that's part of your research design. We need a lot more for that, but we could include that and then keep going. So do we see results in here?
Yeah, just the last sentence in general, earning a post-secondary degree in prison, however, was associated with greater numbers of hours worked and higher overall wages with less recidivism. Just
That's half the results. Where are the other half?
Earlier up in the paragraph, but I just
Where, Sam?
up in obtaining second degree in prison was significantly increased the odds of securing post-release employment,
Right.
but did not have significant effect on recidivism.
There we go. So right there, those last two sentences of the abstract, we have our findings. We've got the result. So all we're missing here is a little bit more about our research design and some limitations. So let's keep going. And I'm also going to kind of talk you through different parts of articles. So most articles, we've always got the abstract first. Then the next section that they have is usually some sort of combination of an introduction and the statement of the problem. So for your policy brief, you'll also have to describe the statement of the problem, why we would need whatever program or policy you're talking about. So later, when you have to write the statement of the problem, you can always look in the intro of these articles. But you'll see right here, it's always introduction, statement of the problem stuff. So look right here, incarceration disproportionately affects young, blah, blah, blah. Formerly incarcerated men don't have as many jobs as those that aren't incarcerated. They earn, less than people that haven't been incarcerated. So these are the statement of the problem, right? People that have been incarcerated can't find jobs and don't make as much money, right? Then we've got a little bit of intro information about education in prison in Minnesota. Blah, blah, blah. Lots more, lots more, lots more. Present study. So this article is actually set up a little bit weird. Usually most articles, and we'll see this as we go through a couple of more, usually you've got that intro statement of the problem. And then right after that, you usually have a literature review section, which inexplicably is after the present study here. This is a little bit weird. Usually we're starting slow, right? So let's look in here. Do we see anything that we might want to include in our research design? There's a magic term in here I taught you guys about on Monday.
The sentence that says score matching or propensity score matching.
Right. So like Ashley said before, we've got our sample, which is Minnesota prisoners released between 2008 and 2007, 2008, and they're doing propensity score matching. So we want to note that. Anytime they're doing propensity score matching, that automatically means there's a comparison or a control group, because we want to, propensity score matching makes them equal, right? So we can note that. So what we don't see here right now is the sample size. So that's what we're missing a little bit. So for some reason, they've got the lit review after this. One thing I will note, for our purposes, you guys don't need to read the lit review section. A lot of times students will start reading that and think those are the findings from this study, and that's not the case. So you can skip the lit review when you're reading through this, because you don't need it. The only reason I would ever suggest that you read the lit review for this project in particular is if you're having trouble finding 5 studies, right? So if you can only find 2 on your topic, if you scan through their lit review, look, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, not Martinson. They're bringing up Martinson. That's the follow-up to that Martinson article that I was talking about. Here's Lipton, Miller and Drake. Like, we've got 7 or 8 similar articles. So if you're having trouble, if you can only find 2, pull up one of them and look through their lit review, and you might be able to find the rest of your 5 that you need. But for the rest of our purposes, you don't need to read this part right here. So we can scan, 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 blah, 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 data and methods. Who sees the sample size here?
9,394.
Oh, yes. Whoever said that. So you said, are you talking about right here? Who said that? I don't know.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So these were all the offenders that were released from Minnesota prisons between 2007 and 2008. But if you look right here, they break it down for you. So there's this many that came to prison without that degree. And of this many, here's our treatment group. We've got 1,200 that earned a secondary degree while they're in prison. So is this our treatment group or our control group?
Treatment.
Exactly. and we can simply subtract to get our control group right here. So anytime you're talking about sample size, what you also might find, if you ever see them say the treatment group, and then in parentheses, they say N equals 1,212, N equals always means sample size. So if you're having trouble finding sample size and you see N equals in parentheses, that's your sample size right there. So we've got everything we need. So let me walk you through the rest of the article. So whenever we're in the data and methods, they're going to tell you their sample size right here. Then they start telling you about the variables that they're looking at. So this isn't necessarily parts that you need to read unless you're confused about something, right? So first they're going to tell you their dependent variables, which is their outcome. So recidivism, and then they're telling you how they defined it: rearrest, reconviction. So they're looking at like 4 different types of recidivism right here. Here we've got our independent or our control variables. And remember, I told you table 1 always lists all the variables. Here they're describing propensity score matching, which you can read this if you want, but I don't recommend it. Here is table 1. So here are the list of variables that they are controlling for to make sure that treatment group and that control group are as similar as possible. So we've got gender, minority, age at release, prior supervision failures. This is how many times they've been on parole or probation and they failed. Prior convictions. Here's a great one right here, metro commit. This means when they were released, did they get released to a metropolitan area or a rural area? So that's a good one right there. Offense type. So are they a property offender, drug offender, sex offender? Admission type. So were they admitted because they violated parole or a new crime? How many months they were in prison? How many disciplinary infractions? If they had substance abuse treatment, sex offender treatment, type of supervision. These are a lot of variables. Like I said, Grant Dude does great work. This is what you should be seeing, right? Are we seeing anything here that he's missing? Not that I can see. Well, actually there is one thing, but we'll bring that up in a minute. Okay, so always just kind of scan through that first table just to make sure that they've got a lot of variables that they're controlling for. So then we've got, this is more about propensity score matching. You don't need to read all that. And then we get into this shit. You don't want to read that. Scan, scan, scan. The only thing that we're missing at this point are the limitations. So we can scan through all of these. These are tables and parts I want to read, but you don't need to read this. You don't need to worry about the caliper, which is actually a little low. I would do 0.05. Doesn't matter. That's not a section for you. Analytical procedures, you don't want to read that unless they hadn't mentioned propensity score matching prior to that. Here's the matching table. You don't need that. We don't need that. And here we have the results. So always start reading it. They might say it in plain English, especially if they're doing propensity score matching, because they already did all that nerdy stuff above where they made sure that those groups were equal. So now they can just look at the outcome. So we can see right here, we've got some results and we've got more results right here, but we've already seen our results. So you would only need to read through this if you hadn't seen it in the abstract. And then they're going to break it down even more. So here's recidivism specifically, and we can see, look right here. So it reduced the hazard, which just means the likelihood that this is going to happen, by 14% for rearrest, 16% for reconviction, and 24% for reincarceration. So if we wanted to put specific percentages with that we saw from above, we've got it right here, but we don't have to do that. Never try to interpret these tables. I have students that will do that sometimes. It's not necessary because they'll tell you it in plain English, right? I'm interested in these tables. If you get a PhD, then you'll be interested in these tables. But other than that, don't be reading that. Now we have the second outcome, which is post-release employment, and we can see the numbers right here. But again, we already saw that, so we don't need this. So the last thing that we want are limitations. So there's no limitation section. So we search for the word limitation. Actually, it's the previous one right here. So they kind of buried it. I think this is part of the results right here. Come on. So, although the findings suggest that prison-based education programming can produce positive recidivism and employment outcomes, it is worth noting the limitations within the study. So here, Grant and Valerie are about to tell us the problems with their study. So for our purposes, as long as you can list at least one limitation, I'm happy. But I also want you to be listing a limitation that you understand. If you're reading through limitations and it's telling you the problems with the Rosenbaum test and the caliper and stuff that you don't understand, don't write that. Send me an email. We can look at it together. Either I can explain that limitation to where you can understand it and write it yourself, or we'll find one that makes sense, okay? But it looks like the first two make a whole lot of sense here. So the first problem they're saying here is post-release programming data wasn't available. So they're unable to determine if people that were released obtained a degree while they were following up on them in the community. So say I'm in the control group, right? I'm one of those Minnesota prisoners that was released and I didn't receive an education while I was there. During the follow-up period, if I got an education, that's what they can't control for. So that's what they're saying here. So if somebody was released and got an education, they're still going to be considered in the control group, which is not really that big of a limitation because what we're studying here is the effect of prison-based education programming, right? So if they got an education outside of prison after they were released, it's not really part of this study, but it's still something that you have to mention. The second one, this is kind of a big deal. They were unable to control for prior work history because they didn't have that data. That is a really big deal. The best predictor of post-release employment is having a job before you were incarcerated. And when we start talking about prisoner reentry, what we're going to find is that most people that find a job after they get released from prison call up their old boss who will rehire them. So what this study is saying is they could not control for those offenders that had a job prior to being incarcerated, which could really affect their employment outcome, right? That is a big problem. It's just something that they didn't have access to. So that's the best that they can do. So when we were scanning through that table 1, that was one of the things that I noticed, that they didn't have pre-prison employment data. That's a really big problem. He just didn't have access to it. That actually is really hard to get a hold of. You usually have to contact the IRS. And even then, there are problems with that because what if they had a job under the table? It's really hard to control for that information. So I'm not surprised he didn't have that. But that would be a limitation that I would want you guys to mention, right? Okay, let's go through another one.
Dr. Lewis, might be a dumb question. Can they just ask the person they're studying, hey, did you have a job? Or is that,
So
it kind of seems like a little, hey man, did you have a job before coming in here? And it's,
so the problem with that, whenever we get access to a giant data set like that, usually we don't know who they are. So if you recall the data set that I made you, forced you to go through with Charleston Police Department, we didn't have any names of those complainants, right? So that's what we refer to as de-identified data. Everybody's just a number. And in order to get access to that much information and for the Department of Corrections to give over all that data, it usually has to be de-identified. So, and then we're also talking about almost 4,000 offenders. Are we going to track down 4,000 offenders? Doing good research is actually very, very difficult. All right, let's look at this one. So we're going to look at a qualitative study here. Okay, so who can find stuff that belongs in the research design? And I also see results in here as well.
The 600 graduates would be part of the research design.
Right. So we've got a sample size of 600, which is crazy. What else do we need? Where are they getting that data? Where's that data coming from?
We can't see that screen anymore, Dr. Hill.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. All right, where's the data coming from? Let's take a look at the title.
Drug court.
Where's the, okay, but where are they getting their information?
Self-reported data.
Right, interviews. So they're interviewed. I mean, we see a lot of, I see 1, 2, 3, 4 authors, and they are all professors, which means they had grad students. So this is how they're, 600 is a lot of interviews. So they've got a lot of people helping them out here. That is a large sample size. So that would not be a limitation right there. So we have 600 people that were interviewed. So that's part of our research design. What about our results? Do we see results in here?
Upon graduation, clients rated the opportunity to avoid jail as a key factor in the decision to enter drug court, and positive improvements in their life as significant in their decision to remain.
Very good. So that may not seem like a really important result, but if you, it is. So think about it this way. If you were in a town that was tasking you with the creating your own drug court, right? What we're seeing here is that people that graduated said the main reason that they agreed to participate in the drug court is because they could avoid jail. So if you were going to implement your own drug court, that might be one of the things that you require, right? If you agree to be in drug court, you don't have to go to jail that day, because this is saying that that right there is what got people to join, right? So it may not seem like that big of a finding, but it is if you're trying to implement this, right? So we've got our findings. We've got a little bit about our research design right here. 600 people, interviews. That's pretty good right here. What we want now are some limitations. So just like I said, we've got our introduction right here. They're describing drug courts. Yeah, it goes on and on. Here's some drug court efficacy. This is research speak for literature review. So what have other researchers found about the efficacy of drug courts? Same thing here, more research, prior research, more prior research. My computer is kind of slow today. Methods, if we couldn't find it before, we've got it right here. Results, if we didn't see it, we've got it right here. Discussion, and there's no limitation section, so okay, here we go. They've buried it in the discussion. So let's look at this first one right here. The exit interviews are only conducted with successful drug court graduates and thus only relate to this population. So that's pretty important when you're interpreting those results, right? We're only talking about the people that were able to successfully graduate. So those people that either failed or dropped out on their own, these results aren't speaking to them. So among the graduates, avoiding jail that day is what got them to join, right? So that's a limitation that is very important for how you interpret these results. if you ever have trouble finding a limitation for a result or for some sort of interview, you can always default with self-report. Whenever you're interviewing somebody, it's self-report. They're telling you, they could be lying. So you'd be surprised how many people will, so where they're getting the data is always something that you want to note, right? Official data is usually better than interviews, especially if their outcome is behavior, right? So you'd be surprised how many researchers just talked to a bunch of people that were released from prison and were like, have you committed a crime since you've been released? That is not very reliable, right? That is a self-report that is a problem that you could note as a limitation. So if you're ever having trouble finding a limitation and you're dealing with interviews, you could always list self-report. It's possible these people are lying. All right, let's look at one more. Oh, wait, hold on, it's drugs. Okay. All right, so we've got everything we need in this article. So who can find me the research design and the results?
Uh, 630 offenders between 1992 and 1993 with random assignment.
There we go. What's the magic word we see?
Randomly assigned.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's pretty much all we need right there. We've got 630 offenders. The only thing I might want you to dig for is how many people were in the treatment and how many were in the control. That's super simple to find. All right, who sees the results?
40% of those 630 offenders successfully completed the treatment program within 12 months.
That's part of it. Actually, the next sentence is the most important part. So what we see here, there were no statistically significant differences between those that went through the drug court and routine probation in terms of new arrests, but those that went through drug court had lower technical violations. So we are not seeing a difference in arrest, but we are seeing a difference in a technical violation. So any time that you are on probation or drug court, basically you're allowed to be free, but you have a list of conditions. If you break those conditions, that is a technical violation, right? So if you fail a drug test or you're out past curfew or you don't do your 200 hours of community service, whatever they're telling you to do that allows you to be free, if you don't do that, that's a technical violation. Too many technical violations and you're in prison. So this one didn't look particularly at reincarceration, but we can see where this is kind of going. Less technical violations is probably going to result in less incarcerations, but I am not expecting you to report that. I want you to report only what the findings say, that this program did not reduce rearrests, but it did reduce technical violations. Okay. So for this one, I've had a couple of students do this one. It's really hard to find the limitations. For a randomized experimental design, it's very difficult. I believe I had to really scan through, like page 28 mentions that even though it was randomized, there were a couple of instances where somebody that was in one had to go into the other, right? So anytime you're doing randomization, it's rare that it's going to be completely randomized. There are usually instances where judges have to move one to the other. So that's the small limitation right there. But if you're having trouble finding limitations or you don't understand them, shoot me an email. We'll Zoom together. We'll find it. I'll explain it. Okay. The more you do this, the easier it becomes. Being overwhelmed right now, or even if it feels like you've got your shit together and then you start doing this and you get overwhelmed, that's very normal. Let me help you with this. Really, my goal is just to teach you how to do this properly. And this is actually best to do in an online forum, because when I do this in person, when we do our paper workshops, we're all crammed in a computer lab together, and I can't help you one-on-one like I can here. So a lot of times students fall in the cracks this way. So when we're online, when we do paper workshops or policy brief workshops, you just schedule a one-on-one Zoom appointment with me, and I can work with you individually. So there are several weeks where you're required, I believe there's 2 weeks that you're required to have a one-on-one meeting with me, but you can do this with me. You can have as many meetings as you want. If you want me to help you with every single step of the policy brief, I will do that. I just want to show you how to do this correctly. And I want to teach you how to know when you're looking at good research versus bad research, because it's really important. All right, questions about this before we go over quiz stuff real quick? Okay, so I want you guys to be thinking about potential topics for policy briefs. So we'll be going over the policy. We'll have our first workshop as a class on Friday. So what you need to be doing is thinking of some sort of correctional program or policy that you'd like to evaluate, okay? So it has to be a program or a policy. It can't be it has to be something that we can evaluate. And the studies that you pick have to be evaluations, not just like, how does this program work, right? So how do you implement a drug court? That's not what we're looking for. We want to see, does a drug court work, right? If you can't come up with a topic or you're just stuck, just shoot me an email and we can discuss, and I'll help you find something. If you have an idea, but you don't know if there's research on it, shoot me an email and I'll help you figure it out. So our first quizzes today, it will be based on all of the information that we learned from lecture 1, as well as chapter 1. So today, let's see. Everybody is going to take their quiz with the exception of David Allen. Where's David? Do I see David? Oh, there you are. Sorry, you were on the second screen. So David, Emma, there you are. Zachary, where's Zachary? Oh, there you are. And Andrew. I thought I saw Andrew. Where's Andrew? Andrew, sorry, let me scan to the second screen. Oh,
Right
there
here.
you are. Sorry, you were on the second screen. Okay, so you four, David, Emma, Zach, and Andrew, do not take your quiz. Everybody else take your quiz. And then on Friday morning, you four are going to take it live. So what that means is make sure, did anybody not download Respondus Lockdown Browser? We all have that? We're good? Okay, so just make sure the quiz opens up, I believe at 10 in the morning. So in 10 minutes, what you can do is open up Respondus Lockdown Browser. It'll take you straight to Canvas, and then you navigate into quiz 1. All right. If anybody has any technological issues, don't stress, just shoot me an email. It's very simple for me to allow you to retake the quiz. If something happens and you get kicked out or some sort of technology, I'll fix it for you. Okay. Questions? No questions?
Do we have to take it exactly at 10? I have a class at 10 or
No. You have 24 hours to take it. So you've got from 10 today until 10 tomorrow. All right. Other questions? Okay. We'll see everybody on Friday.
Dr. Hill, can I speak with you for a second?
Yeah, sure. Anybody else? Did anybody else have a question? We good? Okay.